Welcome to the Delight in the Limelight live stream show. I'm your host, Linda Ugolo, speaking confidence coach, author of the book Delight in the Limelight. And I'm here to help you feel more comfortable with speaking in public wherever it is that you do that, if it's on stage, on camera, in the media, or the meeting room. And if you struggle with speaking confidence, I have a checklist of preparation rituals to help you feel more grounded, centered, focused when you speak. And you can get that at lindaugolo.com/rituals. And I'll put it in the show notes. And speaking of feeling grounded, focused, and centered, I'm excited to welcome Brian Hite today. Brian is a stuntman and a sports psychologist who helps athletes, musicians, dancers, and even U.S. Army personnel to help them develop mental strength, resilience, and readiness to perform at their best. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I am too. As soon as we met through your partner at a conference that I was speaking at, and when she mentioned that her partner was a stuntman, a sports psychologist, I said, "You gotta introduce me." And it was probably months ago that we connected, and I said, "When my show's out, I'll have you on." And here we are.
Here we are. We made it happen.
We made it happen. I'm really excited. And one of the things that really piqued my interest is that I never have really delved into sports psychology. So, can you just describe at least how you use sports psychology and the elements that you are helping people with?
Yeah, it's interesting because when sports psychology mostly comes out of a cognitive theory background. So the theory itself that undergirds sports psychology has been around for a very long time, but the application of that theory to sports specifically really started, I'm not exactly sure when, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but it's been a while. But really what sports psychology is teaching techniques to athletes that allow those athletes to stay focused, to maintain confidence, to continue to stay motivated through the various ups and downs that are inevitable over the course of a season or a career. Um, there are a lot of different facets to sports psychology that really come down to allowing that athlete to be able to perform at his or her best at whatever given moment that might be, whether it's in training or it's at a competition. So
Hmm.
that's traditionally where sports psychology started. And then it branched out and expanded. Some of these techniques expanded to other populations. People started working with musicians, with dancers, like you mentioned, actors. I've worked with stunt people in this field. So the techniques really come down to performance. Performance is performance, and the techniques help people perform at their best wherever that might be. As you mentioned, in a boardroom, at a conference, it doesn't matter. If we're performing these sports psychology techniques, and this is why I don't even like using the term sports psychology. I like using the term performance psychology
Mm.
because it's more all encompassing. It's more accurate, in my opinion, of what it is that we as performance psychologists do to help people be at their best.
Yeah. So, do you see, let's say, mental focus and resilience as one and the same thing, or is it different? Like, how do those fit together?
Yeah, well, no, I think that focus, the way that I think about focus is more present moment. What are you paying attention to? And how are you paying attention to it? There are different styles of attention. We can pay attention broadly in a scanning kind of a way to things outside, outside us in the environment. We can pay attention very narrowly, like focusing on the tip of their nose. We can focus broadly inside ourselves, doing an overall assessment of muscle tension or emotions or breathing. And then we can also focus very narrowly inside ourselves to really pay attention to our heart rate, maybe, and try to slow that heart rate. So in your field where you're talking about public speaking, that broad assessment of what's going on inside ourselves can be very helpful. And that narrow way of paying attention to focus on whatever might need to be dealt with, either maybe the breathing is too fast and shallow, or the heart rate is increased, or there's some muscle tension in certain places that people notice. Their shoulders typically end up by their ears. Things like that can be focused on and dealt with. So it really is not just about what we pay attention to, but how we pay attention to it. That's
Yeah,
what it is that I think about with focus.
I love that. I love that. And like I have a framework that I work with. One is to reveal and heal the root causes of people's anxiety so we clear them away. And then to restore safety, which is about looking into what we're thinking about and to make sure that the thoughts that are in our minds are supportive. And then thirdly, I talk about repatterning our habits. And those are the kinds of things that I put in what you're talking about, which is how to have embodied presence, how to scan for tension and relaxation and ease and breath. And it's kind of like repatterning all the ways that we used to be when we were fearful to repattern place the ways that we can be when we are open and present.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's
and
it's
that's
kinda like
very similar.
swapping those things out.
Yeah, that's very similar to how I approach work with whatever performer I happen to be with. I
Mhm.
pay less attention, I think, to the genesis or the
Right,
past, what might be
right.
driving things, and more attention to, okay, this is where we are now. So how do we move forward? Here are
Mhm,
some techniques for how to recognize when your thoughts aren't working for you. And I do steer away from positive, negative thinking. I don't talk in those terms. I talk in terms of productive and counterproductive thinking,
mm.
because I think that sometimes even positive thoughts can be counterproductive. For example, I'm sitting here doing this podcast with you. If I start thinking about the pizza that I'm looking forward to for dinner, that's a very positive thought. I like pizza, but it's a counterproductive thought in that it's taking my attention away from where it should be, which is talking to you.
Yes,
So
it's
I
it's
think
distracting and taking you out of the present.
yes, and I think that's an important thing in terms of the performance itself. When we're in that moment of performing, being able to be present, being able to keep our minds in that moment is essential. And there definitely are techniques for that. However, I think that that ability to stay present begins earlier. I think that we can set conditions for that present moment mind before we even get into the performance situation, and those preparations are critical.
Yes, I totally agree, and that's why I have a checklist of preparation rituals for that very reason, because we it's not that you wanna wait until you're in the experience to do these things, you want certain things to be automatic, right? So you want to
Mhm.
be able to have a sense of presence be automatic as much as you can. How do you help your clients do that? To be
Well,
to keep their mind in the present, to
yeah,
practice that.
for me personally, there's a four-phase approach that some colleagues and I came up with and wrote up in a journal article for the Journal of Applied Sports Psychology. This was back in 2010 when we were working with the Army personnel. And this four-phase approach has to do with the four phases are before, right before, during, and after. So when we talk about a performance, every performance has a before, a right before, a during, and an after. And I think that a lot of approaches to, again, like you and I have just talked about, setting conditions for success during the performance, have discussed before, during, and after. But that right before, I think, was missing. I think that that's a critical piece. So, for example, if I'm about to stand up at a conference and give a presentation, there's a before. Now, what that before is, I get to define. That before might start an hour before the presentation. It might start a day before the presentation, could start a week before the presentation. But there's a before, and there are things that I can do during that before that can help set me up for success, that can help create the ability to be automatic in that moment, that can at least set conditions for that to happen. Not guarantee it, but set conditions for it to be likely. But then there's the right before, and that right before is when performance is imminent. It is about to happen. You are next. They are about to call your name. You are about to walk up to the podium. This is the right before. And there are things that we can do in that moment to, again, check in, make sure that our energy levels are where they need to be, make sure that our mind is focused on what we want it to be focused on in that situation, making sure that physically, mentally, emotionally, we are exactly where we need to be in order to be at our best right then. And that can happen in that right before. Then we start talking. Now we're in the performance. And there are techniques during the performance that people can use to stay engaged, because distraction is inevitable. We're going to get distracted by something at some point during the performance that we have. So how do we deal with that? How do we recognize when we're distracted? How do we recover attention effectively and move on with what it is that we need to do? There are techniques during. But then this last phase of after, I think people don't give enough attention to either. I think that that's important, not just in terms of, okay, how did I do? Let me think back about, my performance and how could I get better for next time, but just simply to recover, because performance requires energy. So to sit and recover, again, physically, mentally, and emotionally, what are we doing to, yes, assess our performance, but also to recover so that moving forward, we can engage with life again, or even another performance. How many people do we work with who perform multiple times? They give one talk and then they get to sit down for an hour and then they go give another talk. And it's a multiple process that, that they have to engage in. So how do we recover and set ourselves up for the next one? So this 4-phase approach is one way that I've found that's very helpful to structure this idea of, we don't just jump into a performance and hope we're going to do our best. We need to start earlier than that and really deliberately and intentionally create conditions that allow us to be at our best when we want to be.
I love all of that. I really love that. And it reminds me of, I was at that moment before that you're talking about. I was at a business conference for salon owners last fall, and someone who was also speaking there came up to me and said, I know I'll be fine once I get going, but I'm always so nervous in that first 5 minutes. And so I said, well, imagine how you're gonna feel after that first 5 minutes. How do you feel in your body? And she said, "Okay, I got that." And I said, "Now imagine that, you're picking up the microphone and you feel the same energy, you feel the same experience, and just picture that over and over, picking it up and starting that first word, being in that place of flow, being in that place of presence." And she was wonderful. She got on to at her time, and she picked it up and she said, "I just want to thank Linda for teaching me how to start this off with a feeling of confidence." And I'm wondering, like, what would you have added to that for her?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that I explain to my clients is where that nervousness is coming from. It's by definition when our minds are in the future, not in the present, because that nervousness is coming from that anxiety that we're experiencing stems from our worry about what might happen, about what could happen. So we're in the future rather than in the present. And by explaining that, it I don't know, I think it provides people with a little bit of rationale for, okay, so now I don't want you to think about the future. I want you to think about right now. What are you doing right now in this moment to help set you up for success when you ultimately perform? And I think that idea that you, or the guidance that you gave of the mental imagery, is critical. That is a skill that I think is extremely underutilized in every facet of performance. I think people think about mental imagery, visualization, mental rehearsal, mental practice. It goes by a lot of names, but ultimately, I think that they use it not as often as it could and should be used. For example, mental imagery is often used when people are trying to learn things. So they imagine themselves, steps 1 through 10 of whatever it is, and they're learning these things, and they use mental imagery to go through those steps in their minds, or to practice doing those things so that they remember them. And that's great. That's a perfectly valid and extremely useful way that mental imagery can be applied. But it's not the only one. We can also use mental imagery to boost confidence. For example, if we're in a public speaking situation, we might have a very strong concern, worry, fear that somebody's going to ask us a question that we don't know the answer to. I mean, that's a very real possibility. So what we can do is practice dealing with that challenge using mental imagery to uh, figure out how we're going to deal with that situation and practice those techniques in our minds before that situation arises in the moment. And when the situation does arise in the moment, it feels, the description that I always get from people, it just feels like deja vu. It feels like I've been there before. It feels like I already did it. And they hadn't actually physically done it, but they had done it so many times in their mind that neuroplasticity, our brains had rewired themselves to allow for that response to that particular stimulus to be automatic. When you say you want people to be automatic, that's the idea. We're retraining our brains. We are literally rewiring our brains through neuroplasticity to allow the connections that our brains make most often more efficient. So if our brains, it's what we typically refer to as muscle memory. Muscle memory has nothing to do with muscles. It has everything to do with the brain and the connections that are made among neurons. And the same thing is true with our thoughts, with our emotions. All of those are neural connections. So if we can train our brains through mental imagery, we engage our brains with vivid experiential images that we create in our minds. We train our brains to deal with situations in certain ways. When those situations come up, absolutely, it becomes much easier for us. So that guidance about mental imagery, terrific. Motivation is another thing that we can use mental imagery for. So for example, if somebody's, I don't know, you got a presentation coming up and it's just, I don't know, I've got so many different things. I don't really want to sit down and deal with it. I don't want to work on it. This feeling of success, if you can use mental imagery to create the picture of what success looks like, what it feels like, who's around you, what are you saying, what are you feeling, you create that moment at the end where success has been achieved. That can be very motivating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, lastly, I
Okay,
just
keep
want to
going. Yep.
touch you
Yep.
with this one,
Keep
is
going.
anxiety, because this is a big one. Performance anxiety is a huge, huge hindrance to people doing public speaking, and mental imagery can be used to practice that. You just have to be comfortable going into your own mind and creating that anxiety that you know is going to happen. If you know that prior to a talk, you're going to feel some nervousness, some anxiety, you're gonna, which is completely normal and natural. That is a natural response. There's nothing wrong with it. You just need to know it's going to happen. So you create that feeling in your mind, physically, mentally, emotionally. What are you going to feel? And then you practice using some techniques to manage that anxiety. And you can do all of that in your mind so that when you get in that moment, the fear and anxiety comes. It's not a stranger. It's not a surprise. It's not a shock to you. You're comfortable with it because you've felt it so many times and you've dealt with it successfully in your mind so many times. So mental imagery, absolutely one of the best tools I think that exists.
I totally agree with you. And I'm really glad you mentioned this last thing, but I want to just circle back a little bit. Uh, I am a big believer in getting to the root causes and clearing them away, because then I feel you have a lot less to deal with on the anxiety front, because I feel like anxiety is there for a reason. It's not random. I don't think that it's natural to human experience. I think that we've all had programming early on that made it apparent to us that it wasn't safe to speak. So whether it's being, graded in school or uh, performing in the past, or people telling us, like, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, or don't speak back to your elders, or silence is golden, or you're too loud, you're too dramatic, any ways that we've been led to believe it wasn't safe to speak. But given all of that, my chapter 2 in my book is all about mental rehearsal, because I feel that it's such a powerful, as you say, tool that's underutilized, that we can do so much to, number one, manage the fear, until we decide if we want to get to the root causes and clear it away. Not everyone wants to do that. And I always say to imagine how you want to feel, what it looks like at your best. Like, how do you see yourself moving? How do you see yourself expressing yourself? How do you want to feel inside, and how do you want to feel afterwards? And also, how do you want to feel as you prepare for this? Imagine that you're putting your bullet points together or your script together, and see your enthusiasm and your enjoyment. However, what I really like, what you've added, is this idea of using it as a management technique itself to bring in the anxiety, and use that as one of the things that happen, because I do have people imagine, okay, forgetting things is going to happen. You're going to get distracted. You're going to like forget a whole section of your talk, or you're not going to know the answer. And these are the ways that you can handle it with poise. So practice that in your mental rehearsal. But I haven't ever said, imagine, so you have anxiety, imagine the anxiety comes up and create that feeling in your mind and let it not be a stranger, but think about how you're going to respond to it, how you're going to handle it with poise. And I love that. And I thank you for bringing that in, because I think that's going to help so many people with their, because people are afraid of it. It comes up and they panic about it happening. And for me, in my mind, I always thought, well, let's not practice what we don't want. Let's practice what we do want. But so I appreciate you kind of like opening my mind to, no, you can practice this too. You don't have to be afraid of practicing the anxiety. So when you work with, I suppose there are athletes that you work with, there are, Army personnel that you work with that you say, look, you're going to feel afraid. How would you invite them to use the mental rehearsal in that case? How do you invite them to embrace it?
Well, it really comes down to focusing on what we can control, because a lot of anxiety stems from just our perception that we don't have control over situations. And we don't have control over a lot of situations, but we do have things that we can turn our attention to, that we can focus on. So, for example, if somebody knows that they are likely to feel this anxiety, this nervousness going into this, whatever it is that they're going to do, whatever their performance is, then they can focus on what that anxiety feels like. So it feels like a tightness in the chest. Okay, so how do we focus on that? Physicality is a terrific thing for people dealing with anxiety to focus on. Another factor or another technique that can be very useful with anxiety is grounding. It's a technique called grounding. And that is, and it works because anxiety, like I said before, by definition, is our minds in the future. Grounding forces our minds into the present. So grounding is, what are 4 or 5 things that we can see? What are 3 or 4 things we can hear? What are 2 or 3 things we can smell? So it forces our minds into this present moment. And simply because of the nature of the human mind, where we can't pay attention to more than one thing at a time, when we're paying attention to what is now, what is here, what is present in this moment, we aren't paying attention to all those other things that could be creating those what ifs in the future. So that's another technique. So I really guide clients, or I try to identify those things that they can grab control of physically in their mind. Do they have a go-to thought? If it's a performance, and maybe there are certain points in that performance where they might be more nervous than others. This may apply more to longer term performances. So, for example, maybe even in a public speaking situation, you talk for a while, but then partway through, you're going to do some activity with the audience, and you're not as confident about that activity. You're not quite sure that activity is going to go the way you want it to go. So you anticipate anxiety as you set up that activity, which the setting up of activities is a very different thing from just imparting knowledge. And so maybe that's where the anxiety is. Whatever it is, we can latch on to, okay, what do I need to do right now? What is the thing that I need to focus on? And what I really enjoyed about what you said earlier is that you directed people's attention to the very first thing. What is the first thing that you need to do? What is the first word you're going to say? What is the first move you're going to make? What is the first concept you're going to discuss? That right there is critical. And I use that myself in stunts repeatedly. So when I use this 4-phase process for myself when I'm on set. For example, there's a before. We're on set, we're there, we've rehearsed all the stuff, and now we're just waiting. We're just waiting around for our turn to go do whatever it is that we're going to do. That's before. But during that time, I do mental imagery. I go through whatever the stunt is in my mind. I go through the choreography I'm going to do, whatever the movements are. I rehearse it in my mind using mental imagery. I stay warm. I stay, stretched out. I keep myself mentally and physically in a place where, I'm not relaxed, but I'm not in full performance mode. And then I get the call. Hey, Brian, we're ready for you on set. Okay, now I'm moving into the right before. Now performance is imminent. Now I'm going into the place where I'm going to perform. And so I check in and I look at, okay, where is my energy level right now? And what's going on with me physically and mentally? Am I focused? I got to block out everything else. If I've been on the computer, if I've been talking to people, all of that goes away. And I go into what I call my bubble. I'm in my bubble and I put myself in there. And one of the things that I do as I'm standing in my spot and I'm waiting for them to go through their roll camera, sound speed, market, all their things that they do right before they say action, I'm only focused on the very first thing I'm going to do. Whatever my very first movement is, that is where my attention is. I'm not thinking about the whole fight. I'm not thinking about all the different movements that are required. I'm only focused on that first one because I know if I get the first one right, if I can get myself going, it's like you told your client, if you get in the first 5 minutes, then I'm good. Okay, well, then do that. Focus on that, get that part right, and then it will play into and flow naturally into the rest of the performance. And you can trust. And that's an interesting concept too. I don't know if you talk about that at all with your clients, but the idea of trusting that we will be okay in these moments, that's another thing. But anyway, I kind of got off track, but
Yeah,
there's a
but
little something.
yeah, it's exciting. I love what you said. Just first of all, it's fascinating to hear about stunt work because I've never talked to anyone who has done that before. So it is another element of performance that's really high stakes because you're not just performing, but you're doing dangerous things. I've watched your reel several times with your backflips and you're like, oh my God, it's amazing. And the falls, it's like, how many times can you fall and get up? So, I do want to get into resilience in a minute because you're brilliant at that. It's like I made this connection seeing you fall over and over and over why, you speak a lot about resilience. But I love what you said about the things that you can anchor onto in order to bring you in the present moment, the things that you can see, the things that you can notice, and using your attention to your visual attention and your visceral attention inside to bring you into that sense of presence. And the other thing I appreciated about what you're talking about is, this bubble, the idea of like staying open. You're not on high alert. You're not like ready to go, but you're keeping yourself in an open state where you are already warmed up. You are ready to go, but you are waiting. So there is that waiting game that has its own, I guess, process. Would you say so?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, when I was working with the military, there was one situation that I had where I had two teams and what they were doing, they were at the National Training Center, which is like the Super Bowl training event for the Army before they deploy. This was back in 2008 or 2009, I think, when there were a lot of deployments. And so this unit, they had gone to the National Training Center and there were two different groups that I had worked with. One of them embraced what I did and the other was like, yeah, whatever. And so I spent more time with the one that embraced what it is that I did. And what I suggested for them is when they were doing this training, this room clearing training, the way that it works is it's iterative. So they sit around and wait, and then they go in and they clear the building. And then, or in this case, there were 4 buildings. And then they come back and they wait again, and then they go do it again. So it's an iterative process. And it was hot. And they had full gear, so they're wearing 50 to 100 pounds of stuff. And I suggested, look, in between, don't keep doing what they call glass house drills, which is they have the outline of a house taped on the ground, so they know where the rooms are, and they practice going through the house physically using this glass house drill. I said, do 1 or 2 maybe, but use mental imagery in between and then take some breaks. And that's what they did. One of the groups did. The other group just did glass house after glass house after glass house. And they wore themselves out. And the difference in performance from the first iteration to the second iteration, from the one group to the other, was pretty amazing. They were both horrible the first time they went through. But the second time they went through, the group that I was working with, they used mental imagery to practice some of the guidance that they'd gotten from the other NCOs who had given them, some feedback on the first one. And they implemented that feedback using the mental imagery. And then they would get up and they would physically do something, and then they kind of take a break, and then they do mental imagery again. So they just limited the number of physical iterations. And then when it came time for performance, they had the energy that they needed. They trained their minds. They had the same number of practice iterations as the other group. They just weren't as worn out. And from a public speaking standpoint, I think the analogy is some people like to rehearse full energy over and over and over and over again before the actual performance. And I think in a lot of cases, in fact, I would argue in most cases, that is counterproductive. That not only are you wearing yourself out, but unless you are a very, very good actor or performer, you're also losing some of the spontaneity. You're losing some of that I don't know, that intangible something that comes with just standing up and talking and just
Yeah.
being natural with people.
Yeah.
So I think that mental imagery can help, so people can practice their
Yeah.
speeches using their minds rather than actually doing it.
Yes, I think that's great. And the other thing is that I love what how you use this analogy, or not analogy, but this example of these two army teams that, one wore themselves out, but the other, I think there's something very agile about our brains. So when we're doing mental imagery, it allows us to go beyond what we can physically actually do sometimes, and perhaps open up more space for possibility. I don't know what you think about that. That's kind of like just kind of guesswork, because I don't have any evidence to show that. But that works for me. Like when you said about public speakers, some people just keep rehearsing what they want to say. I like to tell people, don't, if you're going to memorize, only do it up to like the day before or 2 days before. And of course, no one's going to listen. They're going to, run through their talk, and that's okay. But the point is, at that moment, strategize how you want to feel given that amount of preparation. And as you said, do you help with trust? Yes, and trust that whatever comes out is going to be just what needs to be heard. And that even if it's not exactly what you had intended, maybe it's even better. Like, keep that possibility open for that. But I want to move on to, you mentioned distraction, and I want to talk about resilience. And I think they're connected, aren't they? Because when we get distracted, we need resilience to get back on. Can you speak about those two things? They may be bigger subjects, in your mind. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think when I think about resilience, I think about encountering challenges. And well, here's the thing that's interesting about resilience is we throw the word around all the time, like we're all talking about the same thing, but we aren't always talking about the same thing. Even in the literature, if you read the scientific literature on resilience, the researchers aren't always talking about the same thing. So the first thing you got to do when you're talking about resilience or reading about resilience is look for the definition. How are they defining it? For example, some people define resilience as encountering a challenge and not getting knocked down that far. You might get knocked down a little bit, but you're not getting knocked down that far. Other people define resilience in terms of how quickly you're able to recover after getting knocked down. And then still other people, and this stems from the post-traumatic growth research, yes, I can recover, and yes, I can do it pretty quickly after being knocked down, but can I actually get better as a result of experiencing this challenge? Can I become better from having dealt with what I've just dealt with? So resilience even itself is a topic that you have to define very clearly. And I think about it in all of those terms. I think, yes, if we're resilient, then when challenges arise, we probably aren't going to get knocked down into that devastated state as easily. It will take a lot to put us down there. And if knocked down there, we have the resources and tools to pull ourselves out relatively quickly. Not easily is the wrong word, but we have the ability to pull ourselves out. And we can, if we take the right mindset and think about the situation in the most productive ways, we can actually we can be better. We can learn, we can grow, we can thrive and flourish as the result of the challenges that we've faced, not in spite of, because of the challenges that we encounter. And so that's how I think about resilience. And I think that some of the literature that I've gravitated toward in that area is interesting because the way I see it, resilience seems like it's a simple math equation, really. It is the more resources we have available to us, the more likely we are to be able to overcome, come back from, grow and thrive as a result of challenges. And when I say resources, I mean all resources: financial resources, physical resources, social resources, psychological resources. There are many, many resources, but the more resources we have at our disposal that we can apply in any given situation, the more likely it is that we will be resilient. So when I'm approached about, okay, so how do I build resilience with this team? How can we do that? I focus on those resources. And given my background and area of expertise with psychology, I focus on psychological resources, mental resources. How can you turn your attention to the most productive places, the most effective places? How can you think and interpret and perceive situations in the most effective way? Training people to realize that the way that they are currently seeing a situation is not necessarily the only way of seeing that situation. I say not necessarily. I think that it's not ever the only way of seeing a situation. It's our spin. We put our own meaning on what occurs in our worlds. And that recognition in and of itself, I think, is very powerful. And then being able to regulate that, manage that, and really turn our attention and thinking in directions that are productive and effective is a tremendous tool to help people come back from challenge when it occurs.
Oh, you're speaking my love language, Brian. I even teared up when you said that we can, about the post-traumatic growth, that we can flourish and thrive not in spite of the things that happen, but even because of the things that we happen. And I just feel that deeply in my heart to be true, and see that happen over and over. And I also love what you just said about that how we see things is just one way. It's an interpretation. My husband and I have this running joke of everything is interpretation. And we kind of laugh at how we misinterpret one another. And I think that happens all the time. And the more that we're aware of that, as you say, the more resources we have, the more ability that we can bounce back or not fall down, as far as you say, and thrive and flourish. Gosh, I feel like I could talk to you for another hour or two, but we don't have time for that today. Maybe we'll have you back on to talk some more. But this has been really rich and helpful and intriguing. And oh, you know what? I see a couple of comments. I have a couple of questions. So let's stay on for a couple of minutes and answer these questions.
Okay, sure.
The first one is it goes back a bit to how do you rehearse so you don't lose that spontaneity? I know how I would answer that. Should we both give our answers?
Sure.
Okay. So Kat O'Sullivan says, how do you rehearse so you don't lose that spontaneity? I like to encourage people to go through their talk saying it in lots of different ways. So using a lot of melody as you go through the sentences, or using different characters of speech, or being loud and then soft. So bringing in lots of contrast, way more than you would ever do in your actual speaking. And to do it when say it when you're doing the dishes or taking a walk. So when you widen your range of expression, then when you get into the actual speaking of it, you can drop into, how do I want to express this sentence right now? Where do I want to emphasize words? So that if you think about yourself as like a tour guide, helping to give your words meaning so other people can understand what you think is significant or strong or effective or interesting, then you are in the moment with the words that you say. And that would be my answer. Take it away, Brian. What would you say?
I would say that I personally recommend people take a top-down versus a bottom-up approach to speeches. And what I mean by that is a bottom-up approach is memorizing everything and just making sure that you have all of the words in place and you say all the words correctly. That's a bottom-up approach. You're not going to forget everything. All the information's there. It all comes out. You've memorized it. There it is. But I think a top-down approach is more important. And by top-down approach, I mean, what am I trying to say? Big picture with this talk. What's the message I want people to walk away with? In this particular section, what do I want people to walk away with? What is the main thing? On this slide, what is the main thing? On this bullet, what is the main thing? If I know what the main things are conceptually from that top down, then I'm much more able to flow with some spontaneity in that moment. So when rehearsing, I would rehearse in terms of, am I hitting these concepts? I just keep these concepts from the big picture overall concept right down to each bullet in mind. And the other thing that I would add is that emotions are incredible resources when trying to learn things and try to remember things. So if remembering order of your speech and wanting to make sure that you hit all the main points that you want to make is a concern of yours, I would encourage you to deliberately, intentionally decide on some emotions in different places that you are going to adopt or that you want the audience to feel. I'll give you an example from stunts. I was talking to a friend of mine who learns fight choreography like that. I mean, he is just absolutely incredible. He can watch this 20-move fight 1 or 2 times and he has it. And I said, how are you doing that? I don't understand. And he said, well, I attach an emotion to every move. So when this move comes, I'm angry, or when this one comes, I'm surprised, or I'm scared, or he attaches these emotions, and that allows him to remember the flow of the whole thing. So what you want in a presentation is flow. You want it to flow logically, succinctly, concisely from beginning to end, making all of your points. So including emotions in different places, they can serve as anchors as well as allow you to fluctuate the way Linda would, like you were just talking about, I mean, it's the ups and downs come with those different emotional states. So those would be my 2 recommendations is 1, top-down approach, just big picture. What do you want on the presentation, the section, the slide, and the bullets, and include the emotions in different places that you personally want to feel in those moments, as well as the emotions that you want to convey to the audience that you want them to experience.
So great. So great. I love that. Thank you so much. Let's take a look at this last question. It is Kat asks, how do you heighten awareness of the filter we see the world through? Want to
Yeah,
take a
that is a great
I
question.
know, I
I
know.
actually I have a book that came out in October. It's called Begin Again: Utilize the Wisdom of Eastern and Western Ideologies to Achieve Your Full Potential. And in that book, this is a big part of a lot of the chapters. It's a book that's not a book in the traditional sense. It's one of those sit down every day and just read a little bit. There are 183 chapters in it. Each one is about a 2-minute read. But a lot of them are focused on this, on developing our awareness of the fact that we are looking through the world through filters, and these filters are our beliefs and our values. So how do you heighten awareness of the filter you see the world through? I would start with identifying what are your core values. What are those things that you believe are at the heart of who you are, the things that make you you at your core? Those are your core values and your beliefs. What are those strongly held beliefs about people? I am this way. People are this way. The world is this way. Those are beliefs that we hold. And they are simply beliefs. We take them as reality. We take them as objective truth, but they aren't. They are simply beliefs. So the ability to understand our own values and to identify those strongly held beliefs is step 1, because once you have those in place, you can start to recognize more easily those moments in life where those values are coloring your interpretation of the situation, where the beliefs are influencing the meaning that you're assigning to any circumstance you encounter. So that's how I would suggest heightening the awareness of those filters.
Yeah, that's great. I love how you say, when we encounter times that we may be filtering, and I know for myself, it's something that I've thought a lot about myself. For myself, but I haven't gotten as far as you have, as writing a whole book, looking at this. But I can tell what I thought was kind of a funny story. Last summer, I was sitting on the hammock singing outside on the back porch, and my husband came out, and he interrupted me to kind of talk, and I was kind of into singing, so I was kind of humming as he was speaking to me, and then he said, "Oh, I'm sorry," I just said, "I'm sorry," and he sat down, a little ways away from me, and I thought to myself, "Okay, he's angry that I didn't listen to him fully. I didn't give him my full attention, but I am singing, so I'm just gonna go ahead and sing." So I continued to sing, and, and then I said to myself, "And you don't have to hold on to any worry about him because he can just handle that. I'm just gonna sing." And, later on, he came and he sat in the other hammock, and I said, "I just wanna share with you how I interpreted what happened a little while ago when you came out. I realized that you probably I wasn't giving you my attention. I felt bad about it, but I decided I was going to let that go and just enjoy my singing." And he said to me, "Well, what I was thinking is how nice it is to listen to you sing."
Yeah,
I thought,
we never know. Yeah,
we never know.
I
We
mean,
never know.
that's a whole different thing of thinking that we know what's going on in other people's minds, this mind reading that we are absolutely certain that we know exactly what's going on in somebody's minds, particularly those people closest to us. Because why wouldn't we? They're close to us. We know them. Of course we know what's going on in their minds. Except you know what? We don't.
We
Not
don't.
all the time. And so that communication is really important. I think that's great that you all were
Yeah.
able to communicate and that came out. That probably strengthened a bond in a way that uh, that is special.
Yeah, and I think this does have implications for us speaking because and any performance because we do interpret. We interpret what other people must be thinking, what they might be thinking, and that adds to this worry. And circling back to what you said earlier on about bringing yourself into the present moment, anchoring yourself with things that you can see that when you are performing, you are in the here and now, and that is our work, is to bring ourselves in the here and now so we can connect with our audience, we can connect with our material, and we can create a transformation experience, not just for others, but for ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point too, that we can start worrying so much about what the audience is thinking and how they're interpreting what we're saying. And I think that there are two ways, and they're a little bit conflicting that I think about that. One is you can't control the audience and what they think. And so literally no attention needs to be put on that during the presentation. You need to be focused on you and delivering the material the way that you need to deliver it. However, once you get better at public speaking and once you get more comfortable with public speaking, then I think reading the room becomes important. So then I think it is helpful to look for body language, to look for facial expressions, to look for fidgetiness or look, different things that might communicate to you that you need to speed up or you need to tell a story or you need to engage the audience or you need to not engage the audience. But these are things that are, I think, at a higher level of public speaking that come with practice and comfortability. At the beginning, if public speaking is a challenge, I would say, again, recognize what you can control, which is you, recognize what you can't control, which is them, and put your attention on those things you can control and give the best performance that you know how and let the chips fall where they may. Analyze it afterward, not in the middle of.
Yeah. And as I'm sure you would agree, it's a journey.
Absolutely.
It's a
Life
journey,
is a journey.
and
Everything's a
life
journey.
everything's a journey, and we can look forward to these improvements that we can make as we gain more experience and curiosity and presence. Yeah. So, Brian, how can people find you?
You can find me at beginagainperformancepsychology.com. That is the website that I have. You can find me at Begin Again Performance Psychology on Facebook as well. On Instagram, it's Begin Again Psychology. And I have a podcast that I co-host with another friend of mine. It's called Poking Holes with Blinders. He's another stunt guy that we've known each other for 2.5 decades and just enjoy talking to each other. And the blinders that we're talking about are similar to the ones we've talked about here. These beliefs that hold us prisoner in some ways to how we perceive the world. We need to poke holes in those blinders so we can see more things and consider more avenues of just how life works. So We have Poking Holes and Blinders. That's a place where you can go. Pokingholesandblinders.org is the website for that. And like I said, I have a book, Begin Again, Utilize the Wisdom of Eastern and Western Ideologies to Achieve Your Full Potential. That's out on Amazon. You can find that there. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
Wonderful. That's great, Brian. Thanks so much for coming on. We had to just take this conversation a little further because there's so much to talk about.
I've really enjoyed it, and I'm happy
I
to come
have
back whenever
too.
you want. It's a good,
Okay.
it's a great conversation. I think what you're doing is terrific, and I wish you all the best of luck with all of the things that you're doing, and all of the people with whom you work.
Thank you so much. And so, everyone, if you liked what you heard today, let us know in the comments and be sure to catch our next live stream show and as well as the Delight in the Limelight podcast, where I've been going through all the past experiences and messages that we may have heard that have contributed to any speaking fear that you have. So go over and check that out at delightinthe limelight.com. And I will see you on the next episode.